Aid with spoken. Children of Eternity, In the Beginning. By Macaulay Christian. Digital narration performed by digital voices. I began writing what would eventually evolve into Children of Eternity more than 20 years ago. It started with a single name, Holindrian. From his inception, he married spiritual curiosity with secular reality, one foot in the transcendent, the other in the stubborn gravity of politics, culture, and consequence. I didn't have the language for that tension when I was younger. I only knew it was the kind of tension that wouldn't let me go. In those earliest embryonic stages, the story was both simpler and more ridiculous. Holindrian was a semi-divine human on a planet called Kazani. Alongside the motley crew of the starship Victoria, he battled an evil regime, the Electrians, and liberated humanity from their tyranny. It was clunky, it was earnest, and from what I remember, it read like the literary equivalent of a sizzle reel. Spectacle first, meaning second. But even then, especially then, there were threads that refused to die. The conflict between liberty and tyranny emerged early and never truly left. Over time, that conflict took center stage in Holindrian and the Human Revolution, released March 11, 2025. That book became a prequel to Children of Eternity, but it also became something more personal. An opportunity to tell the story of Holindrian's fight, not only against a ruling order, but against his own family, to restore personal liberty and democracy to a world long bereft of freedom and artistic expression. It also gave me a place to solidify the broader history, to make the world feel as if it had been turning long before the first page. That prequel had its own long gestation. I wrote a first draft in graduate school, then returned to it over the next decade. In the process, it gained roughly 20,000 words, grew connective tissue that linked it to Children of Eternity, and finally received the title it should have had all along. Somewhere in that stretch of years, I came back to the book that would become Children of Eternity, though it didn't have that name yet. 10 years ago, it was still called Sacrifice of Angels. When I sat down with the resolve to rewrite the novel, I assumed the title would survive. I was accidentally reminded of that recently when I rediscovered an old outline, the former name typed boldly across the top like a relic from a previous life. The rewrite that followed was a purge. With the exception of a few names, characters, places, entities, entire plot lines were cut and rebuilt from scratch. Characters and their arcs were merged, separated, invented, or erased as the story revealed what it actually wanted to be. Only one element of the plot comes to mind as having survived relatively unscathed, and even that feels less like survival than inevitability. The sense that history is never merely history, that it is lived, inherited, and paid for. By the time I wrote the final sentence of the epilogue, however, Sacrifice of Angels no longer fit. Not for me. The title felt too tied to what the story had once been, too derivative, too superficial, too eager to imitate the things I loved rather than wrestle with them. I had been tremendously proud when I wrote that earlier book. It was the first novel-length work I ever completed, and Children of Eternity would not exist without it. But age has its own quiet editorial function. You return to the same material with different questions, and sometimes with fewer excuses. That shift became painfully clear when I tried to write the sequel. The narrative sprawled. It ballooned. Threads multiplied and never resolved. That draft remains unfinished, gathering virtual dust on my hard drive, a reminder that ambition without clarity is still a kind of indulgence. And yet, I haven't abandoned that first attempt. A copy of Sacrifice of Angels still sits on my bookshelf. I keep it there on purpose. It's proof that the road was real, even when the destination wasn't yet. The story of Children of Eternity has changed as much as it has stayed the same, growing alongside me as I developed as a writer and as a person. Narratively and symbolically, it represents a first step. Narratively, with this book, a series begins that intentionally harkens back to the tradition of classic speculative science fiction, serious, philosophical, and unafraid of scale. In the vein of Tolkien, Children of Eternity treats its mythos as something that not only exists, but has existed for a very long time. Symbolically, it marks the beginning of an examination of modern, primarily American society. where we have been, where we are, and where I believe we ought to aspire to be. Children of Eternity is part of what I call a future myth. The Apocalypse series begins as an allegorical telling of the world we know, but with each book it gradually shifts from allegory to myth, from where we are to where we could be, from what we are to what we could become. The simplest way I can describe the Apocalypse, when asked, is through a moment from Star Trek, The Next Generation. In the final minutes of All Good Things, Q tells Captain Picard that the journey ahead is less about exploring the cosmos than it is about exploring the nature of existence. For me, the Apocalypse pulls on that thread beginning with Children of Eternity. Where will humanity choose to go? What will we choose to become?